Welcome back to Things That Are Harder. So you've decided to do replay. So you've decided to do replay. That's a pretty cool feature. So I have one question. How are you going to do it? There are 3 ways to do replay. The first, and maybe the most obvious, is to record the screen as a movie and then allow that movie to be played back. Basically, almost like you're recording a Twitch stream. This is an option that wasn't really available that long ago because it's only recently that the hardware has become powerful enough to record and compress video in real time off of a console or off of a PC. It's not a bad option. It's easy. It allows you, depending on the video codecs you're using, to scrub back and forth and do rewinds and replays, but it is limited. You are stuck with what was played on the screen. So the amount of things you can do with that content is limited to post-process effects on the screen itself, the whole frame. You could do editing in terms of cutting pieces out or letting footage run forwards or backwards, but that's about it. There's not a lot you can do beyond that. One important thing to remember is that if you are doing video editing inside your game, this is an entirely different UI path from the rest of your game. Cutting, moving bits of footage around, adding music, those sorts of things. That's not UI that currently exists. So while you might be able to get some sort of footage capture up and running relatively quickly, you are also signing up for a whole bunch of additional screen work that's going to need to be done and tested. The other 2 ways to do replay are a little bit different. For those of you that are familiar with implementing multiplayer, both of these are going to look kind of familiar. The first is essentially replication. You record everything that happens as it happens, and then you're able to play that back and recreate what happened after the fact. This is how a lot of multiplayer works. You record people's positions as they change. You record damage events and the like. It does require that you have a starting point, so you need to have some sort of game state that you can return to and then run this replicated data against to play the replay. Depending on how your game sim actually works, something that this method may actually allow you to do is when you're recording the new state of something through the replication is to actually record the previous state at the same time. What this would potentially allow you to do is to actually run your game sim backwards, and then rather than having to start at a game state, you could actually just run your sim backwards and undo all of the replication that had occurred in order to get back to an earlier state. That opens up some interesting possibilities in terms of actually allowing you to rewind time and the like. Obviously more complicated than what I just said. For example, not all events will simplistically just work in reverse. You may have to write customized special code to unkill a creature, for example, or to respawn a creature that's been despawned. So an additional complication, but interesting to think about. Because you're saving literally everything that changes, this form of replay can get pretty big. Not as big as recording the actual frame, but it can get pretty big. It can be quite expensive to do. It might not result in the exact identical playback as what actually occurred. If you want proof of this, as I mentioned, this is very much like multiplayer. If you've ever had any kind of popping or slight deviation in multiplayer, it was caused by a divergence in that replication that was corrected by further data further down the line. So the good thing about this form of replay is it gives you the opportunity to do other interesting things because you're essentially running the game back and then applying this replication on top of it. It lets you potentially do some interesting things. You can allow the camera to be moved, or even control the camera yourself and frame interesting things that occurred. The final, and what I would consider the most elegant way to do replay, is by recording player input. This is the way that multiplayer used to be done by the best games like 20 years ago. It's very small because all you're recording is the actual things that the player did. But it's very, very difficult to do because what it requires is that your game engine and your game simulation be perfectly deterministic. What that means is if you run through the same scenario and that input occurs at the same place, that exactly the same thing will occur every single time. And at first you might think, well, of course that's what's going to happen. Obviously, of course my game engine is deterministic. But chances are it actually isn't, because chances are there are a whole bunch of things going on that you're not even really thinking about that are actually changing the timing of what's occurring ever so slightly. So let me give you a couple of examples. So if you're walking down a path and then you cross a point and a creature runs in and runs forward and swings at you, but he's not quite close enough and he misses. Okay, so you recorded the player's input walking down the path. But on replay, maybe the streaming data for that space that you're walking through was already in memory because you just did it. So it loads just a little tiny bit faster, which means that the creature is able to get a little tiny bit further forward, which means when he swings, he doesn't miss, he hits. Or you're doing something that involves random numbers, and the next time through, when you generate that random number, it's a different number. So things diverge there. I tried to do an input recording replay on Jade Empire, and it was non-divergent for about 5 seconds. I think in reality, it was actually probably divergent immediately, but it took about 5 seconds before you could tell that it was diverged beyond all recognition. I think this kind of deterministic game sim with input recording is unbelievably elegant and beautiful, but it's also unbelievably difficult to implement. If you have an existing game that uses input recording to run its multiplayer simulation, which some games still do, then you are very close to having something that can do replay. If you have a game that does multiplayer through replication, you may be able to similarly record that multiplayer stream and use that as the basis for a replay system. If you're a single player game, either of these is going to be a significant amount of work to add. Something with the two gameplay recording methodologies as opposed to the stream recording is that unless your sim can run backwards, you may not be able to scrub through your footage in the same way. But the gameplay recording methodology allows you to do things you simply cannot do otherwise. Move the camera, or even more interesting, things that actually impact gameplay, like recording a playthrough of a level and then letting the player go back through and play alongside the recording of themselves as if it was an additional player. With the input recording, it might even be possible to embrace the probable divergence and have the input continue even as the game changes underneath it. So there are interesting possibilities that are simply not available if you're simply recording the screen as the images are drawn. So which one should you do? Well, it's not my money, so I say do the pretty one, do the input recording one. It's the elegant, beautiful solution. Obviously, that's my bias showing. Let's ask the question a little bit differently. What would I do? So my answer as to what the most elegant solution is and my answer to what I would actually do not match. If I didn't have an existing multiplayer framework, I would almost definitely look at doing the stream capture solution, recording the frames of video as they're drawn to the screen. It's the least likely to result in an endless mire of bugs. If I did have an existing multiplayer solution, I would at least have a spike done to look into the possibility of using that tech and repurposing it for the purposes of replay. Likely that tech is going to be a replication solution, so it may or may not be possible to use it. Chances are, when you actually do a spike, you're still going to find that the easiest and cheapest solution is the screen recording solution. So unfortunately, despite my biases towards the prettiness of the input recording solution, you're probably going to end up with something where you're recording the frames of video as they're drawn, unless you have a gameplay purpose for it. If you do, then invest the time and build something that meets your needs, and good luck. Hopefully this was useful to you. If it was, please give this video a like so that more people can see it. I will see you again soon. Thank you.